name's Anna May, and I'm a forester and the 4th generation in the Starker family. The Starker Forest started in 1936 by my great-grandfather, T.J. Starker, and it's been in the family ever since, going to my grandfather, Bruce, and then my dad and uncle, Bart and Bond, and now me and my brother and a couple of my cousins are also involved in the business. The Starker Lecture Series started as a way to honor TJ as well as Bruce, because they're both really interested in forums for debate and new ideas in forestry. After they both passed away, the family thought it'd be a good way to carry on their legacy.
Welcome to the 2022 Starker Lecture Series. My name is Shannon Murray, Program Director for the Elliott State Research Forest here in the College of Forestry. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Apinafu Band of Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are a part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. The theme of the 2022 Starker Lecture Series is Women in Forestry, Inspiring Leadership, which focuses on women who act as agents of change within the forestry and forest products sector, as well as within their communities. The College of Forestry graduated its first woman student, Pauline Bartos Sandoz, over 75 years ago. Today, the college celebrates the accomplishments of all women who are students, faculty, and alumni in our community as it strives to become a more inclusive space for all. This series will explore the triumphs of women as well as the myriad challenges they face in forests, mills, research labs, and beyond. This year's Starker Lecture Committee is made up of an ad hoc group of all women who work within various fields of forestry and within the college, and is chaired by Julie Woodward, Acting Director of Forestry at OFRI, and Jessica Fitzmaurice, Event and Outreach Manager at the College of Forestry. Today, we will hear from Amanda Rao, who will talk about pyrocultural forestry, connecting people and nature through fire. There are 2 upcoming events in this year's Starker Lecture Series. On April 20th, we will hear from Edie Sonhall, and to end the series, there will be a 1-day capstone workshop on May 10th. Throughout the day, we will explore all aspects of forestry with a focus on women's leadership and the future of women in the forestry and wood products industry. We are pleased to have over 17 women from a variety of careers joining us for panel discussions and activities throughout the day on May 10th. Dates, times, registration, and more information can be found on the Starker Lecture Series 2022 website. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Amanda Rao. Amanda Rao started working in wildfire management as a member of a 20-person hand crew based in Springfield, Oregon in 1999. After finishing her undergrad in philosophy at the University of Oregon, she began to pursue a career in fire management, working for the U.S. Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, gaining knowledge and honing skills in fire suppression, prescribed burning, fire ecology, and pyrosilviculture. She studied natural resources at Oregon State University and completed a master's in natural resources, fire ecology, and management at the University of Idaho in 2012. That same year, she co-founded the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council, for which she has twice served as chair. Amanda has since worked as fire manager and burn boss for the Nature Conservancy in Oregon and Washington, assistant professor of practice specializing in regional wildland fire resilience for OSU Extension's fire program, and in her current position as the Oregon Department of Forestry's prescribed fire coordinator. Please join me in welcoming Amanda Rao. Turn on my microphone. You guys hear me? All right. Wow, here we are. I had the pleasure of giving a guest lecture in Meg Krawczuk's
class a couple weeks ago, which I feel prepared me well for this because I actually got to do an in-person lecture, but I didn't do it without my mask. So this time I'm doing it without my mask. I'm really excited to be here. So with that, I'm going to get my presentation launched. So just give me a second to do that. Go. Good. Okay. And this should work. And clicking. Okay. Well, I'm going to continue the land acknowledgement in talking about the landscape that my ancestors encountered when they arrived here in the 1800s. There was a landscape that looked very much like the painting you see here. This painting is by Paul Kane. It was completed in 1847. And it shows the landscape of the Willamette Valley, as I said, as it was encountered by my ancestors who were colonial settlers and who arrived here in the 1800s. What we see is a landscape that is marked by heterogeneity, by sinuous lines between forests and open land, unforested land. We see wildlife. We see individual trees in the uplands, but we see concentrations of trees in the lowlands. And then in the background, we see some fire, perhaps, some smoke. So it's a landscape that was shaped by fire and to this day is still marked by those impacts. Northwest Oregon's pyrocultural history is best understood by correlating some of the fire history with places that people lived. The maps both show Northwest Oregon. The coast is on the left-hand side, and then Portland to the north and Eugene to the south. And so the language groups of the Kalapuya people that have been acknowledged already were really the primary influences in the Willamette Valley. But I think it's important to note the coastal peoples as well, because they were doing their own kinds of burning. And then you had fire that was along the coast range. So you've got fire coming from the Willamette Valley, you've got fire coming from the coast, and then you have natural fire on the Cascade or on the coastal mountain crest. So a lot of fire on the landscape and mostly coming from people here. So the first kind of burning that we can note here is incidental, meaning fire used for heat, light, cooking, etc. But the kinds of more intentional burning would have been for various cultural purposes, including hunting, harvesting of berries, root harvest, pest control, creation of weaving materials, and widespread broadcast burning. So a lot of fire on the landscape, really shaping the way in which it appeared to people like my ancestors when they arrived. Another illustration of what this looked like, preference for individual trees over stands. This is important. It's quality over quantity here. And this is important as we move forward into a fire future where we're very aware that stand densities and overabundance of trees is part of our problem. And that will be a theme throughout my talk today. The Willamette Valley ecoregion in the 1850s, based on General Land Office data that was collected, was largely upland prairie and wet prairie with savanna and woodland. And most of that was created through indigenous burning, intentional application of fire on a high frequency. So the land fire data that I pulled to create the map on the right shows fire frequencies that I would argue are not quite as frequent as what actually was occurring. More like every other year in some places. But the range is great. So we start at 6 years or maybe even less, somewhere around 3 years, all the way to 1,000 years in gallery conifer forests, or gallery and conifer forests too wet to burn very frequently. So this really indicates a high level of diversity, a lot of differences at just a few feet of topographical change. So in the valley bottom, you'd see very frequent fire. You move a few feet up and it might reduce by a few years. And then as you move up in elevational gradients, you see a decline in the fire frequency. And that's all driven by people using fire. Some of the plants that are seen in the wetlands and the prairies include camas. That's a very well-known food plant that is used as a food by indigenous people throughout North America, certainly not limited to the Willamette Valley. Other species include tarweed, brodia, wild onion. And you move up into the savanna and woodlands, and you see other species such as checker lily, and of course, well known for food source to many people, acorns. It's important to note, though, that another creature that appreciates acorns is the acorn woodpecker, for whom woody woodpeckers call was actually patterned after that. So something to note. So we see less fire frequency in the savanna and woodlands, but still a perpetuation of that dependence on fire. Now, I think we need to pay attention to something here in this photo, aside from the fact that people are there and there's fire. It looks a lot like modern day patch cut, clear cutting. We see there's a stand here, and then there's an open area here. There's an open area here. And what that would indicate is that some of the fire culture of past cultures in the Willamette Valley were very much doing the same thing that we see today in terms of being tolerant of removal of overstory. There wasn't a problem. And so with that, we start to shift. We go from an indigenous way of being with the land towards an enlightenment way of thinking that imposes itself upon the land. And we move from those sinuous edge effects towards straight lines. We see people on the landscape more predominantly. We see fences. This was taken in the Chehalem Valley in Oregon, and this is showing what happens during colonial settlement, that the land starts getting compartmentalized, broken into pieces, and it's being utilized for agriculture. So what happened to all of that 1850 distribution of vegetation? Well, what we have today is a very small component of that, largely because of that agricultural conversion of this landscape. It really became a place where people were able to utilize it in a more intentional way. Is that much different, though, than what was going on in the past? That's a good question. The people were using fire and agricultural methods to propagate plants such as camas. And so we have a new arrival of colonial settlers. They also wanted to use this space agriculturally. So initially, this is what they were doing. They were keeping the trees out. They were slashing and burning and doing agricultural practices. That kept the structural composition of the Willamette Valley in that open character, even if it didn't create the same characteristics in terms of plant composition. Now, you guys might notice that this is the McDonald Dunn Forest down here. And so it wasn't always a forest, actually. It was more open in the past. And that was because of people who were burning here in the Willamette Valley. And so this is really just illustrating that in the absence of disturbance, the Willamette Valley will become forested. Indeed, it will. But what does that mean? Is that what we really want? When we have an altered overstory, we also have an altered understory. The understory was what was historically being managed for here. So what side of this are we managing for? Do we want to manage for the overstory, or we manage for the understory, or both? I would argue that we should manage for both, and we should recognize that the more trees we have in the landscape, the more susceptible they're going to be to fire, especially under climate change scenarios of the future. So what we're seeing is a suppressed pyroculture in the Willamette Valley. And what that moves from is trees growing in like this to trees starting to die. So we've seen this, that the landscape actually cannot really sustain the amount of trees that are trying to grow on it. And we know there are far more trees on the landscape today than there were 100 years ago. And when those trees start to die, what happens? Well, we have increases in surface fuel loading. We also have increases in live vegetation because all of that sunlight hitting the ground allows things to grow. And people who've done forestry, opening up the canopy, know what happens, things grow. And then that additionally lends to trees being exposed to some of these adverse impacts from fire. And moving along in the artistic timeline here, I think it's notable that we see there are some Indigenous people in this painting, and they are not over here. And the description I saw of this painting was that they had been forced away from here, this area, but I would argue that they would prefer to be over there. than to be over here, perhaps. But this is a change that is colliding with the last slide I just saw, which is trees growing in and dying, civilization forming, and then we have the 2020 Labor Day fires. So I grew up on the Mackenzie River here in Oregon. My dad was a millwright. He was one of the people working in the mills, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom, dreaming of being like a writer or an actress, I think, but she did a great job raising kids instead, and I get to now sort of be her shining star in front of all of you. And so the Holiday Farm fire came within half a mile of the house I grew up in. And, I'm a fire practitioner, I'm a fire ecologist. And it was so devastating. I mean, I still have PTSD from that fire. And I told myself, like, you don't get to have PTSD. You're a fire ecologist. You didn't run from the fire. But, knowing that you could burn something like I do and then not being able to, that's a real problem. So we need people to have the power of pyrosilviculture and pyroculture back in their hands again. Because if somebody like me who understands fire that well can be that traumatized by something like that, that means that we all can be, and we all need the power to change that fear back to empowerment. So the 2020 Labor Day fires were a huge wake up for me in the colliding of the fuel problem and this landscape issue with communities that I really care about, that I'm a part of too. And so, I thought about this. Well, were those fires, everybody asked me, like, were those fires unusual? Well, no, actually, they weren't. We see they land here not on Oregon's largest fires ever on the record. They land somewhere in the middle. And you remember when I was showing you those first slides about the Coast Range? The biggest fires in Oregon history are in the Coast Range. And that's a very fire infrequent system, right? So we also know that not only were those not the biggest that we've ever seen, but that we can expect them to get a lot bigger. And I just ask, do we actually think that what happened is going to keep happening, or do we think that's a one-off? I mean, that's a debate I hear a lot. That was a 40-year event or a 100-year event, so we don't need to worry about that. Well, in Western Oregon, Douglas fir establishment has historically been associated with episodic periods of warm, dry climate. And so when we have these kinds of events, that sort of resets things. And as I'm sure most of you know, Douglas fir is a shade intolerant species, so it really likes the reset for it to establish itself. So we're in a warm, dry period now, and we are seeing more widespread fire, and we can expect that to be aligned with this historical pattern. But there's more complexity to the situation than that. And when you look at west side moist Douglas fir forests, typically the story is they just burn every so many hundred years. But the reality is that there is fire that occurs that does not take everything out and start the whole thing over again. And so we need to understand that in order to better answer the question of what to do about 2020 Labor Day fires of the future. I'm going to argue that pyroculture and pyrocultural forestry will bring stability to complex systems like these that are variable in terms of intensity and return and extent. It's our opportunity to bring stability and certainty back into a system that has a high level of uncertainty. That being, we don't know when these events are going to occur. We knew the winds were coming. We did some preparation, right, during those 2020 fires. Are we going to do something differently in the future? And that's the question. Even just today on the Starker lecture tour, Michael Curran from the Oregon Department of Forestry was there talking about how unburned slash piles were sending embers ahead of the main fire and starting new fires. Unburned fuels did contribute to that fire not being controlled, not during the first 24 to 48 hours when it was under extreme influence of winds, but once the winds had died down, they still couldn't catch it because of how much fuel was propagating fire spread on the landscape. We need to get a handle on that. I'm going to switch a little bit here to talk about things around the Willamette Valley. Pyrocultural forestry and Huckleberry is something that I've put some of my energy and time into over the years. The effects of huckleberry management on forest structure largely have to do with removal of canopy. So a lot of what you'll hear me talking about is unintentional impacts from practices of pyroculture. With regards to huckleberries, women have been considered the master burn ecologists. They've been the ones to do most of the burning and decide when. There was unintentional burning by through just the logs that were used to dry the berries that were set on fire left to burn, and perhaps that's the way that it was discovered that burning the berries was beneficial, that logs were left behind burning. They returned to find the patch burn. They noticed the increased yield later. There's also regeneration of plants, of course, because of fire. And then just the creation of those early seral conditions. So throughout the Cascade crest, there were patches of early seral conditions in the midst of what were otherwise considered infrequent stand replacement fire regimes. Huckleberries have a high cultural value to many tribes, and they can be used throughout the winter because they store well. And the best fields of huckleberries have been found largely in unshaded areas with high productivity. So that's what you see on the Cascade crest. Throughout, of course, the plot data from forest inventory analysis shows that huckleberry is found across the Cascade crest, mostly relative to elevation. And where it's found, it's generally, when it's being managed culturally, is found in open areas. But it also is found in understories where it doesn't produce fruit. I would be remiss at not mentioning Robin Wall Kimmerer and her book Braiding Sweetgrass when mentioning Oregon coastal pyroculture. If you haven't read her book, she does have a wonderful chapter in there called Burning Cascade Head. And we actually did burn Cascade Head, and I reached out to her afterwards to let her know because I thought that would probably be something she would appreciate hearing about. So I had the opportunity to connect with her about that. And Oregon coastal headlands were burned more frequently than any other part of Oregon. If you look at the data in land fire, it shows the highest frequency. These headlands, when they were burned, were maintaining fire breaks between those forests that had that infrequent high severity fire regime and low-lying areas. And then, of course, through the connection of salmon, rivers, and fire in ceremony being highly important. Well, that was basically my acknowledgement of the land, if you will. So now I'm actually going to start my talk. And drink some water. So what's pyrocultural forestry anyways? Well, I come up with a few things here. It can be cultural practices that actually directly affect the forested area where you're trying to get a certain impact, but it can be indirect. And I think a lot of what I'm talking about here is actually indirect. It is maintenance of cultural values that may have more to do with the understory, that then have an impact on the overstory and create conditions which are actually beneficial beyond the cultural practices. Forestry based on objectives best met by bringing together people and nature through prescribed fire. That's something I've learned a lot about through learn and burns, training exchanges, and other forms of bringing people into the fold of fire. But I think really what I'm getting at here is that we need a paradigm shift in forestry away from focusing on silviculture and agriculture and towards pyroculture, meaning doing forestry with fire in mind up front, because fire is going to drive everything that we do in the future. Pyrocultural forestry practices, they influence at every time scale, but mostly in these sort of middle regions. I mean, I guess I could say that this practice has a lot of influence when people are doing it. I've seen hearts and minds change with the flame, just the flame, and seeing what it does. But it really has more to do with the events and the fire regimes. And in the Willamette Valley, it's undeniable that the fire regime here is anthropogenic, driven by people. And what's so interesting is how that interfaces with what we call the natural fire regimes, the lightning-induced fire regimes, and where that all comes together. There may be some value in tussling that out and separating them, but I think I find more interest and value in where they overlap and work together. And that's really what pyrocultural practices are about, is how to work with fire on the landscape, given the existing fire on the landscape. David G. Lewis has told me that it was well known that fires were rolling down from the high country out of the Cascades here with east winds. That's been happening forever. And burning here was a way to answer to that. And it still is. So we need to talk a little bit about what prescribed fire is here, because that's a big part of this. So it's fire intentionally applied to vegetation. This is my very simple definition. Should be controllable and with good intentions and legal authority. Okay, but yeah, you get what I'm saying. Obviously, we hear all about fires or hazardous fuels reduction, fire hazard reduction. But prescribed fire can be used for so many different things, and cultural purposes is a big one. And I'm not just talking about cultural fire in terms of indigenous practices, but I'm talking about pyroculture overall. Pyroculture that is suppressed in all of us that we need to restore. Restoring and maintaining ecological function, that's big site prep for forestry and planting. I got to see some really nice broadcast burning. It was so great to see broadcast burning with trees planted in it. I mean, that's a rarity in Oregon anymore, and we need more of it. Invasive species management, I'm really excited about that. I love targeted fire for invasives control and pest control as well. Obviously, grazing and forest management, silviculture, pyrosilviculture, plant production, you name it. There's so many different things prescribed burning is used for. So now I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about the difference between wildfire suppression response and what I would recommend we shift towards. So this is the model we're in right now. And black arrows generally in this model mean not good. Unfortunate choice of white versus black here, but regardless, what we see is overall wildfire suppression response is not really having any beneficial impacts here for us. It does have some decreasing effect on our non-fire budget, but overall, it generally leads to decreases in increases in landslide hazards, increases in risk in the long term. And even though the arrow's pointed down, it's confusing because what that means is it's still increasing it. So when you take and add a pyrocultural response, and that's meaning proactive use of fire, getting fire back in the hands of the people, then you can see for future fire seasons, not saying this is going to happen right away, that you have some decreasing effect on the susceptibility of values. What are those values? Well, you treat around and burn around the things that are valuable to protect them, right? So that might be your home. That might be a really special tree. That might be a weather station. Landscape hazard, same thing. But the ultimate goal here is to reduce risk, right? That's the idea. And right now, the wildfire suppression model is not doing that, but we're caught up in that cycle. And it's a very difficult one to break. And I'm not going to say that's an easy thing because I'm a firefighter. I spent many years putting fires out. And I know how necessary that work is. So I am never going to suggest that we stop doing that work. But if we don't add to that and bring it into balance with a pyrocultural response, then we will be continuing to go down this path. I would love to see the same amount of resources put into firefighting, put into fire lighting. That's really what needs to happen, right? Okay, but we don't have that kind of money. So where are we going to get all this help and resources? Where are the boots on the ground going to come from? Well, they're going to come from all of us. Anyone who wants to get involved in this work, right? It's not just paying firefighters to go do it for us. And what we really need is co-management. And that can't just be from colonial settlers like me. It has to come from many different places. Well, one of those places is the tribes. And the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network is an effort from on the part of the Nature Conservancy to promote fire-related cultural restoration knowledge and practices in large landscapes. And it's using controlled burning for cultural purposes led by Native American elders and fire practitioners to perpetuate traditions and to support forest resilience and hazardous fuels reduction goals. It started in Yurok-Hoopa-Karuk country, and then it spread from there. And I think this is a really nice way to sort of capture in their vision the kind of language that's used in a pyrocultural approach to forestry. This is very different than a very linear scientific technical approach. You use words like life, thriving, laughing, kids, playing, sea, river, pre-contact landscape, land, humble, respectful feeling, prayers, herd, connection, growing stronger, fire, rain, land. Those are the words you hear in that vision. And that's what connects people to fire and nature. But another way to get kids started early, get people started early, is to put fire in their hands when they're young. And typically it's women teaching children to do that. If you talk to Bill Tripp, who's fairly well known at this point from the Karuk tribe, about his start, it was his grandmother teaching him from the time he was about 2 or 3 years old, how to light fire. And on the left-hand side, you see Margot Robbins from the Cultural Fire Management Council teaching children how to light safely with adults around. Yeah, we're not just giving them matches. No, that's not how it works. It's teaching children. It's teaching children, not training them not to play with fire. That's what we do right now. We train children not to play with fire. We need to teach them how to use fire responsibly with adults around. So this is my son. He's been on a couple of prescribed burns now. And there's been people who are like, whoa, you're letting your kid do that. I need you to understand the BTUs here are like 0. This was in the winter. It was so cold. It was like people were wearing jackets and lighting, trying to make things burn. So you start them on the low end. And this is the same place I start new fire practitioners. Very, very low end, low risk, no regrets burning. Yeah. And this is how you create a pyrocultural legacy. You take care of children and you start them young. Here's the life stages. Intergenerational teaching and learning is a lifelong thing, right? That they get the kids started in Trex here. I mean, that's where they're shooting for. This is from the Karuk, Hoopa, Yurok, and IBPN. But this over here is from a recent training where we had a mother with her 5-week-old baby there. And she was breastfeeding her kid. And then she had her friend there her friend has her kid on her back and then this woman's kid on her front. All 3 of us breastfed our children together on the burn. It was the best. Yeah. So this is what the pyrocultural legacy looks like. Women as agents of change means women being moms at work and getting to bring their children into the fold of what they do. So I'm going to switch. I could talk about being a mom in fire, like probably the whole time here, but I'm going to talk about some other stuff now. So prescribed fire training exchanges are an important component of pyrocultural forestry because they bring together 3 components of what are really an important mix. So the outreach is telling the story, just like I am right here. I'm just doing outreach, basically. I'm telling you a story. We need to talk about these things. We have to. That's why I'm here. Because if we don't, then people don't think that there's hope. They don't think there's a possibility of doing things differently. They just live in fear of fire. Training. People needed to be trained to learn how to do this. Bill Tripp learned from his grandmother. My son's learning from me. I've learned from other people. I train and teach other people. And so that's part of the legacy. And then treatments. We've got to get more fire on the ground on our terms. We have to, in the places that matter, where we live. And so this is where this cultural cross-pollination and adaptive experiential learning and training environments, this is where the future of pyrocultural forestry is coming from, in part, not entirely. The training exchange program has grown immensely over the years. It started in 2008 with just 68 people, and it's grown now to 10 times that number. It used to be almost all nature conservancy, and now it's an incredible diversity of participants from fire safe councils, volunteer fire departments, you name it, NGOs. So the Trex program is designed to bring together people from all different backgrounds to share knowledge with each other. So we'll have someone from the College of Forestry who's getting a PhD right next to a firefighter in their 3rd year who really wants to learn more about fire ecology. They talk to the PhD researcher or the PhD student who then wants to learn more about how to swing a tool properly. And they talk to that firefighter about that and learn from each other. It's magic. And it has created not only amazing amounts of treatments on the ground, but has really moved the needle in terms of social license and developing pyroculture. We joke around that people go to treks, they usually don't want to leave, and we kind of have to do this re-entry thing with people because they get so immersed in this space and are so happy to be able to use fire and have that experience that they often have to be sort of counseled to go back to the real world. So if that's maybe a little bit of an incentive to consider getting involved in going to treks, you don't have to have previous training. You take the training and get your fitness requirements met as part of going. So now I'm going to try something here, folks. I'm going to play a video. I hope it works. And it's about the Indigenous Fire Practitioner training. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that first. So this grew out of contracting with an individual who wanted to create culturally appropriate fire training for tribes and Indigenous people. And so the Fire Learning Network funded this person named Rodri Wiseman to develop this curriculum. Then they delivered it to 2 tribes in Washington, the Nisqually and the Chehalis. And then they came to Oregon to help us deliver it for 3 tribes here. And so we'll see how this goes. Okay, good. Okay, so the first time I went to this place, this is the Andrew Reesner Wildlife Preserve. It was when everything in the Willamette Valley was too green to burn. And I was walking around and it was crunchy. There were oak leaf litter and ponderosa pine leaf litter under my feet. And I was like, this place could burn right now. And I thought we were out of prescription for our burn windows. And the manager of the property, Katie McKendrick, was like, well, we want to burn here. I said, well, we should start planning for that. And there was already a traditional ecological inquiry program here that for Native youth, for the Siletz tribe, that was being conducted on a regular basis. And the only thing they weren't doing yet was burning. And so we went ahead and basically created a training program and then did a live fire event. And these are all tribal members here from the Klamath tribe, the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz, and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, as well as 1 member of the Chinook. And they, this is just their test fire in the very beginning, and now you're seeing they're continuing to light. So the property is owned privately by a family who's very interested in Indigenous land sovereignty. And so they host tribal members to participate and practice their traditional practices on their land. Part of this was actually funded by a talk by Robin Wall Kimmerer for Mackenzie River Trust. And so the proceeds from that were donated to this event. And I don't know if she realized that I was part of that or not, but I'm sure she'll hear about it. So at any rate, this was also funded through the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, as well as contributions from Oregon State University Extension's Fire Program, Eco Studies Institute, the Long Tom Watershed Council, the Collins Foundation, Bonneville Power Administration. I'm sure I'm missing somebody, but a lot of organizations threw down for this, and everything culminated in a wonderful burn window in October. We were really fortunate that this worked out. But I think it's also notable that we're finding more burn windows at times of year when we didn't used to have them because of climate change. So while climate change is actually kind of eking into our traditional burn windows, and I've heard a lot about this from the Forest Service where they're concerned that they're losing their windows, the windows are showing up at other times of year. And so this is a late burn, but it was beautiful. It worked out great. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that actually. Capitalizing on burn windows outside of fire season. And I think another thing to note here, some of the folks who were there asked, do we really meet our objectives? Well, I went back in there a couple weeks later, and one of the objectives was to reduce some of this sprouting of madrone, and we did. So it's really interesting when you go back and see some of the work you might have done later. You may find that things are different than you realize they would be. Okay, so this is getting to talking a little bit about those winter windows. Prescribed burn associations, first though, are landowner-led cooperatives. The model is one that has been utilized across the country. It started in the Southeast, and it essentially amounts to landowners getting together to pool resources to conduct prescribed burns together. And Oregon's got one officially started in the Rogue Valley, and then kind of a nascent effort starting here in the Willamette Valley. California's got it dialed in. They have a hub and a website and a way to start your own or find one in your area. So the state has really gotten behind the prescribed burn associations and their funding positions to coordinate them. So somebody's paid to basically bring everyone together, get grant money to buy a burn trailer, get everybody out to do burns, and then they go to different landscapes to help conduct burns. What's notable here is that, and the reason I put global temperature change by month here on this slide is because the changes we're seeing and increasing are in these odd months when we can actually get some burning done. In January and February can be really great burn windows. We actually have been having some really good burn windows in Oregon and California, not more recently, but both in January and February. And the prescribed burn associations are more uniquely positioned to be able to capitalize on those windows because firefighters are typically employed seasonally during fire season, which we know is sort of becoming all the time now. We haven't quite, accommodated that yet. In Canada, they have decided to employ their firefighters year round because of this. And I hope we move to that in the United States as well. But until then, and in addition to that, prescribed burn associations and landowner-like cooperatives are ways that people can take this back into their own hands and start putting fire back on their own land. Now I'm going to move into a little bit of policy stuff to talk about Oregon and what's been happening in our state to enable pyrocultural forestry, which, I didn't think I was going to get into this business for policy and insurance purposes, but I've become very interested in that stuff because of what I realized, which is that it's what creates the conditions that that allow us to actually go out and do this work. So it relies on people with good intentions and legal authority to burn, the social license that's built through things like treks and outreach, but also enabling policy. First, just to kind of give you a picture of the federal policy timeline and how things have changed, at the beginning when I was giving my acknowledgement of the land, I didn't really talk about this, but this came into play with this very heavy-handed suppression approach, which started around more or less as a result of the Great Fires in 1910. And as a result of that, we've had a lot of prohibition on fire, a heavy-handed suppression response, but over time, we've come around to the cohesive strategy, which doesn't mean that we don't still have a heavy-handed suppression response at times. But the transition has been one from striking down the monster and seeing fire as the thing to be feared to the thing to be adapted to. So this is more as the general, but we're going to talk more specifically about Oregon. Nationally, the biggest issues around prescribed fire are related to liability and insurance currently. We still see trends of increases in prescribed fire. In Oregon, our prescribed fire acres are trending down a little bit, but we're still kind of holding steady with the rest of the West Coast. The Oregon Prescribed Fire Council is an organization which Shannon mentioned I was part of founding and have chaired. And part of the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council's mission is to get behind policies that enable conditions for pyrocultural forestry. It's a venue for practitioners, states, academics, tribes, et cetera, to come together to promote, protect, conserve, and restore the responsible use of fire as a land and natural resource management tool. The council has basically 5 bins, which were created through a strategic planning session in 2019. That was funded thanks to the Fire Learning Network. And we were able to develop a pretty robust plan that we've actually been sticking with pretty well. So on policy, we wanted to shift the prescribed burn liability. We haven't shifted the liability, but we were able to get behind House Bill 2571 which studies liability and insurance, and that was passed during this last legislative session. And then the Certified Burn Manager Program, which here it's called Prescribed Burn Manager Program, but the Certified Burn Manager Program was authorized under Senate Bill 762. We also have an objective of developing and expanding and maintaining an adequate workforce. We've done that through supporting learn and burn events and the establishment of the Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association. We are still working on our outreach and communications, but have a really nice website now with some help from Sustainable Northwest. We have 3 active chapters under our organizational infrastructure, and a 4th one forming in the Willamette Valley. I think our information exchange is a lot more efficient because of a paid coordinator who unfortunately just left for another position. So we are hiring, Sustainable Northwest is hiring for a position which will include the coordination of the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council. Great job as a wildfire program manager. Please apply or encourage your friends too. And then sustainability, so funding for the Prescribed Fire Council has been, that's the way that our council has been successful, is because the U.S. Forest Service has been supporting us. They've committed a lot of funding to our organization and have stood us up really. But the Fish and Wildlife Service has as well, Fire Learning Network. The Nature Conservancy supported me in my time. Oregon State University has been a huge partner with the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council, also supported me in my time while I worked for them. So that's what the council's been up to. And then one of the things that we got behind was the revision of the Oregon Smoke Management Plan in 2018. What that more or less involved was a very unusual move, which is allowing more smoke in the air. That's very rare. We don't generally go that direction. In air quality and anything related to the Clean Air Act, it's almost always, how do you clean up the air more? How do you put less smoke in the air? A provision for allowing more smoke in the air from prescribed burns only was included. Really what that meant was that the metric for measuring an intrusion into a community was changed, where it used to be a nuisance. So I could just be walking down the street, I could smell some smoke. If there was no nephelometer there to actually measure the air quality, I could just call DEQ. They could verify, yes, you smell smoke. They could start a process of an intrusion report from that, which takes about 8 hours for the Oregon Department of Forestry to complete. And when those add up, that's a lot of work. It was discovered that that was really not effective in deterring smoke events. And so what we needed to do was change the smoke management plan. And what that resulted in was the number of intrusions dropping dramatically. So here's House Bill 2571, which I talked about a little bit, but I'll describe more in detail. This requires the Department of Consumer and Business Services to study liability for prescribed fires and to examine accessibility of and barriers to insurance coverage. There is a problem with contractors and nonprofits who conduct prescribed burns losing their insurance. And part of the reason for that is confounding wildfire and prescribed fire. So insurance companies don't necessarily see the difference between my kid lighting the burn that was putting off very few BTUs and the wildfire that burned down Paradise. So they don't see those as being that different, and that creates issues. Well, if you change the standard of care for liability in the state, that will give the insurance companies more comfort. So if we have gross negligence, what that means is that I would have to willfully do something wrong, meaning I decided it's a burn day. The winds are supposed to be 40 miles an hour. It's fine. We'll just burn anyways. Okay, probably shouldn't have burned that day. That was willfully negligent. Yes, I should be held responsible for that. But say the winds are supposed to be 4 miles an hour today. It's a great burn day. And we start burning, and then the wind just all of a sudden comes out of the south at 40 miles an hour and nobody predicted it. Well, under simple negligence law, I'm still responsible for that and I can still be held liable. Under gross negligence, I cannot. So if an insurance company looks at that, they want to insure the gross negligence side, not the simple negligence. So that's what this study is partially about, is looking at how can we shift in Oregon to a gross negligence standard of care. And this is due to the Legislative Assembly this summer by July 1st. Under Senate Bill 762, this is requires the Oregon Department of Forestry in consultation with the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council to establish the Certified Burn Manager Program by rule. The Certified Burn Manager Program was previously established under a House bill, or maybe it was a Senate bill back in 2001 or 1999. It was 1999, and then they created the curriculum in 2001, but it never got implemented. And so it was sort of like, you can do this, but you don't have to. So in this case, it's saying you're going to do this. And So that program is now being stood up. It also clarifies cross-boundary prescribed fire permitting process, because in the state of Oregon, when fire crosses an ownership boundary, it's considered prima facie evidence for a wildfire. That does not make for good conditions under which to conduct cross-boundary burning. So we need to fix that, and that's also part of 762. And this rulemaking is to be complete by November of this year. So this is just more detail on the regulatory statute about the prescribed burn or the certified burn manager program. But what's interesting about this is that it does give gross negligence coverage if you are a certified burn manager. So it's some incentive to go through the program, but it's not a required program. So you can conduct prescribed burns in the state of Oregon and not have a certified burn manager. You don't have to have that certification. But if you want the alleviation of liability associated with it, then it's helpful. As well as going through the training to be able to be the best burn manager you could be. So now I'm going to walk you through a couple of scenarios because I think it's really helpful to see how this plays out under different circumstances. So let's say I want to do an oak woodland and ecological underburn. It's in ODF protection, but it's in rural Lane County. What do I need to do? How do I get a permit? Well, it turns out I need a permit from Lane Regional Air Protection Agency. And that's because I'm doing an ecological burn. And then I actually need permission to burn from ODF. So that's one scenario. Let's look at another one. I want to do a lagging / pile burn. Okay, well, it's outside of ODF jurisdiction. So I actually have to go through the Rogue Basin Open Burning Control Area of Jackson County. And the Jackson County Fire District gives the permission to burn, but DEQ gives the air quality permit. Okay, so what about a prairie restoration broadcast burn? Well, so this is in State and Fire District, Marion County. In this case, the permission to burn is technically supposed to come, sorry, I'm like looking at my own notes going, I can't see this here, but so this is basically, you have to go through the local fire district, but my experience is they don't actually write you a permit. So you consult with them, you tell them you're burning and it's okay, but they don't actually issue any permits. So nobody wants to put their name on it. Air quality permit still through DEQ. And then finally, if you're burning ponderosa pine in an underburn in Klamath County, you don't have to do any air quality permitting and you get your permission to burn from ODF. So I do this to illustrate how confusing it is throughout the state to do this. And this is why we don't have more pyrocultural forestry, because people are going, how do I do this? And then they either go, they start down the process, they get shut down for smoke or something else, or they don't start down the process because it's too complicated to figure out where you live and who you talk to and how do you do this. So that's really why I did that. It was not because I expected you all to follow everything, but it was because the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council was asked, can you help us map some of our constituents? Can you help us map out how you get permission to burn and how you do this? And so we started making a big flow chart. I guarantee you this is easier to understand than the big flow chart that we made. Although I think we've posted it online for people to see, so you can go check that out too. So what I'm getting at here is that we need more fires. We need less acres of fire on the landscape, and we need more fires. We need the opposite of this. We need more fires and less acres. What we've done is we've selected for large fires, a small in number, of devastating consequence, because we remove all the easy fires, the little ones that you can almost stamp out. I know how many fires I put out that were easy, that took nothing. Those are not the ones we should be putting out. Those are the ones we need to be putting on the landscape. And we need more of those small footprints. And I'll hear, oh, well, is it worth burning if we can't burn a big block? Yeah, and in fact, we should be doing more small blocks. We shouldn't be telling ourselves, oh, we can only burn if we burn a big area. No, burn what you can. The cost per acre goes up when it's smaller area. I always say burn as much as you can. I'm not saying don't do that, but don't not burn because it doesn't seem significant. We need every little fire out there on the landscape. We have plenty of big fires. We have plenty of big fires, no problem there. We need a bunch of small, little, moderate to low severity fires that are chill, that my son can light. That's the fire we need. And I know from my own experience, there's so much preoccupation with like, do we need objectives? Do we burn it hot enough? I don't know. Who cares? Just get more fire on the land. Why? Because it'll look like this if you don't. and that's full of poison oak. Who else gets poison oak here? Horrible. Yeah, get it really bad. Ha! That's what you get, poison oak. Yep. But then, do you want to hang out there? I want to hang out there. So this is an oak woodland in Eugene that we burned. I think it was in 2016. And oh my gosh, it was so it was a really fun burn, and it looked so great afterwards. And it was really eye-opening for me as one of those moments of like, oh yeah, this is why we do this, because this is what we want. This is where we want to hang out there, not here. It's so simple. It's just pictures. And these pictures, this is how I'm ending my talk. These are all the women that, not all of them. In fact, if you're not on here and you know me, send me your photo, because I'm going to keep building this. This is the first time I've done this, and I'm going to add more and more and more until like you can't tell anymore what's going on. But these are the women I learned from. Some of them would call me a mentor, but I would tell you that they're my mentors too, and they're the future. Most of them are younger than me, and they're going to carry the torch. But women like Elizabeth, Aziz, and Margot, I'm learning from them, and I'm trying to do what I can to help them and others out. But since this is about women, as agents and change in forestry, I thought this was the best way for me to end, is just showing you all my fire friends and women that I've learned from over the years. And with that, I think I'm going to take questions.
Okay, we do have time for questions, and we can take questions both from people here in the room and those of you online. We have some people monitoring questions coming in over Zoom, so type in questions there as well and raise your hands if you have one in the room.
We know that smoke can have very serious health effects, and I see that that it's required to get some permits from DEQ. But how is that whole picture wrapped into what you're talking about with pyroculture, the health effects of the smoke that's released?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think you all have experienced the smoke from wildfires, of like days and days of inundation. Anybody who's lived here for a few years now, I guess. And so we know what that impact is like. How many people here have experienced impacts from prescribed fire smoke? You have, okay. And so comparatively speaking, this is kind of where I go with this, is they're real when you have a prescribed fire smoke impact, but it's typically incidental over a short duration of time. And wildfire smoke impacts tend to be long-term and have real consequences. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards are based on 24 hours of exposure. That's typically longer than the amount of continuous exposure to prescribed fire smoke that you experience. It does happen. I'm not saying it never does, but it's fairly rare. It's very common to have long duration exposure to wildfire smoke. I mean, like all summer last year, basically. And so I guess I would argue that it's real. Smoke is real. It's a very important thing to consider. We have to manage for it. We don't have a choice. But wildfire has a pretty much, there is no management of smoke with wildfire. It just happens. And then what we do is we turn around and we tighten all of the constraints on prescribed fire based on smoke, when the real problem is coming from wildfires, and the reduction of wildfire smoke partially comes from production of prescribed burn smoke. So you produce a little bit of smoke that takes out some of the potential for wildfire smoke later. So there's somewhat of a trade-off there. But the key is, when I burn or anyone else burns, they can do it based on predicted conditions. That is not the case with wildfire. Wildfire smoke's going to go wherever. But I look, and this is a very common constraint that shuts down burning. The smoke's not going to go where you want it. It's not going to go high up enough in the air, and you're going to cause an impact. So when you look at, for example, burning in the Eugene Springfield area, the wind vectors are so tight, that we have maybe 5 or 6 burn days a year. So a lot of it gets constrained to that point, but it's just not something that can be ignored. We basically manage for prescribed fire. We manage prescribed fire smoke for health impacts and safety impacts to the public. And we don't do that with wildfires. We just manage on the other side, which is try to deal with the consequences, but we can't plan wildfires around human health and safety, and we can with prescribed burning. don't know if we're supposed to choose.
It's just following up on that. Why don't you need a air quality permit to underburn?
No, that's just in that part of the state.
Oh, just there.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying is like you go on, if you want to underburn pine and not get an air quality permit, go out to like rural, like Klamath County. So, and it's just, it's the wonkiness of Oregon's smoke management plan. It's the way, and if you ask someone at the national level from DC who manages this stuff dealing with smoke management, they're like, yeah, Oregon's got a weird thing going on over there. So it doesn't make sense, but yes, if you underburn pine in one place, you will need a air quality permit, and then you do it somewhere else and you don't.
I imagine that, you know, through all of the lectures that you've given and people that you've worked with over the years with increasing carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere, you've gotten a lot of questions about the relationship between carbon emissions and fire.
Mhm.
And I'm curious about how you respond to people who have that concern.
Well, it probably gets back to a similar approach that I took with the smoke question, which is that you will get better carbon retention from prescribed burning because you can plan it for not consuming everything, which you cannot do with prescribed fire. But I also think it's important to note that carbon sequestration through rejuvenation of grasses and by underground storage is important, and that fire contributes to that when you're rejuvenating grasses, right? So I know there's generally a lot of focus on storage in woody biomass, but that underground storage can be enhanced with prescribed fire because of rejuvenating grasses, which then can take up more carbon as a result. Mhm.
An online question from somebody who is thinking of increasing fire on the landscape, and that they sort of recognize that landowners think that there should be more fire, but are less likely to do it on their property. And so with that in mind, the question is, you mentioned small land co-ops or pooling resources to burn, but is this an exception? Are these little co-ops how you change minds in one community at a time, or one mind in the community at a time?
It's happening in California. They're all over the place. It's not happening here yet. It's just started. It's very nascent here. We have one official. It's Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association, and they are moving forward. They have someone who's a point person who's coordinating and getting some funding. I think in California, it's happening. And if you'd asked me that like 4 years ago, I would have said, I'm not sure, because they were just getting started. And the prescribed burn associations in other places have had more economic drivers. For example, in the Midwest, when you are eradicating eastern red cedar, you're rejuvenating all of the native grasses, and then the cows are putting more pounds on as a result, it's pretty easy to get people together to burn because they're getting a very direct economic benefit. When that's not the case, and you're burning more for this deferred hazard reduction where you're not sure, is the wildfire going to come or not? I don't know. If that's what you're doing for, then it might be a little harder to justify and get people together. But I'm going to maintain that they have a lot of potential here. I think going to the Cal PBA website, that's if you look up prescribed burn associations in California, you'll find their website, and it's pretty straightforward. You know, they've got where to go find one, and they've got a bunch of them already established, and where to start one. And they've been doing a lot of burning. I mean, to the point that I think there's been some concern about the number of people out there burning on the landscape, and wondering if, you know, there's enough training and experience going on, because these PBAs are pretty homegrown. You know, it's not like you have to go through a training necessarily. You show up and you start learning with people. So I think at some places they will be more successful than others because of that economic factor, and then the capability of people to show up and do that. Not everybody who owns land is physically capable of going and doing burning. So, you know, that's a factor to consider as well. I think the answer, though, is it remains to be seen in Oregon, but I would argue it is making a real difference in California, if nothing other than to just give people a sense of empowerment after living in fear and having their homes burned down and all this other stuff, to just be able to get back in there and reestablish a positive relationship with fire after having it destroyed like that. I think that's valuable in and of itself.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi, she's the one choosing. I want to choose, but I can't. Hi, James.
So in your new position with the state, the way that I at least see the ODF is primarily as a protection agency.
Yeah.
And one of the sort of biggest constituents within that is industry. And so I'm curious how you in this new role have been communicating the pyroculture to industry state.
Well, gosh, James, I've only been here for 5 weeks and I just got done onboarding, but okay, yeah. I've, as part of the Resource Advisory Committee for the Certified Burn Manager Program, we have representation from a lot of representation from industry, Associated Oregon Loggers, Oregon Forest Industries Council, and they are all about the Certified Burn Manager Program. Initially, industry was resistant because it was perceived as being mandatory. It's not, it's a voluntary program. It's if you want the alleviation of liability, you can do this. But once there's a relationship between alleviation of liability and your insurance. If you don't care about, you just want to pay for the insurance, then you don't need that and it's fine. So it's shifted from, we don't need that, we're not interested, to they're all in, everybody's on board and participating. And so we have, like on the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council, AOL, OFIC, and then Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and the Environment, FUSI, at the same table having conversations about fire. So that to me is an indicator that there's some good consensus around this issue. I know that industry wants to burn more. So, you know, that's why they're on board. It's pretty straightforward. The other side of it is, who's going to pay for a burn if it goes south, if it doesn't stay in the lines? And that answer is still not, we don't have that answer yet, because we haven't fixed that side of the problem, which is the suppression liability of up to $300,000 if you light a fire and it goes onto your neighbor's property and causes a need for response from a fire suppression agency. So we need to get that part figured out. That's a sticking point, but it hasn't hindered that really consensus around, from everything from the far left side of the environment to industry, of all being on the same page, more or less, about moving forward with more burning and the Certified Burn Manager Program.
Great thought. Just curious, I really appreciate your comments about, you know, we put out the easy fires. We do a really good job, and you know, Forest Service puts out 97% of the fires. It's yeah. How do we change that thinking? How do we change the policy around that? And what sort of decision matrix would have to be in place to decide where you could let those burn and where you
So we got 40, okay, 440, 20 minutes left. All right, cool. So, all right, so I have so many thoughts on this because it's been a lifelong concern for me. When I worked for the U.S. Forest Service, one of my colleagues and I actually came up with a map that all the firefighters could use so they knew where all the different treatments were. Every single treatment on the district was on this one map. So, you know, if there was a prescribed burn, it had been just mowed, it had been thinned or whatever, to give a decision-making space for expanding fire footprints. On that same district, Mark Rapp, who was the fire management officer there, taught me a lot and gave me a lot of the oomph that I have about fire. He loved growing fires out and he did it all the time. He'd like race in there before the firefighters were like, wait, you guys stop, don't put this thing out. We're gonna take it to these roads, and he'd grow the fire out. And so the district had like basically kind of little prescribed burns made out of wildfires all over the place as a result. So that was the risk tolerance of that manager on that landscape who knew the ground really well. And, you know, we were going with that in creating our maps because he was gone and we wanted some decision tool because he knew where all the treatments were in his head. That's how he rolled. But when we elevated that to try to get a delegation of authority from on high to do that sort of work, it got shut down. And why? Well, it's partly because of all the different parties that have a say, because it's not just the Forest Service deciding on their own. They're listening to the organization I work for now too. And the Department of Forestry is not necessarily representing that same interest. of growing a fire footprint out if the adjacent landowner has a bunch of timber that they don't want to see burned up. And so that's where the decision space gets complicated, because if the Forest Service could just make a decision on their own without all of this input from others, maybe they would go that way. But if they're going to have somebody else going, no, you can't do that. What if it comes over here? Then that narrows their decision space down. You know, federal fire managers are actually very well protected for the most part by the Federal Tort Claims Act and the discretionary function. And so they can make decisions to do those sorts of things, but there's a lot of personal consequence of failure. Even if they don't lose their job, it's still a mark. And I think that weighs heavily on people when they're managing risk and deciding which direction to go. You know, if we put the causal burden around fire on the fuel and not the ignition source, then things will be different. But what we do is we say, who starts the fire is the cause of the problem, not who let the fuel accumulate. So that's where our real issue is that if we dealt with the fuel accumulation as the cause, then we could let those fires roll around because they wouldn't produce flame lengths that were so threatening. At Sycan Marsh Preserve, there's an area that's burned 4 times since the 80s. It's a totally fire maintained area. It burned in a wildfire, I think in 87, and then it's burned, prescribed burned 3 times since. This is a saying of Chris Gunn's, burn the burn. That's what they did there. And I got to be a part of that. The last time we burned there, I was pregnant with Hans, my son, and I stayed out of the smoke, don't worry. But I was in there like walking over flame lengths, just like this, you know? You could walk around the burn, it was fine. They were like this tall. No, who's gonna worry about letting a fire like that grow? Nobody, because the fuel's been managed. And the fuel was the cause, not the fire. So when we get the fuel dealt with, then we can do that more. And so there's the complexity of who influences that decision space. There's the complexity of the risk of allowing that fire to burn, which in the moment might not be much. Like when I walk up on that dinner plate that's barely smoldering, that's a lightning strike. It's easy to put it out then, okay, but no, let's grow it out. Well, then you grow it out, and then all of a sudden you get an east wind event, and all of a sudden it rolls into town. They're going to go back to who decided to let that dinner plate grow. And that's what people are thinking. That's what fire managers are thinking when they're trying to decide whether or not to let a fire get bigger. It's not the moment, it's the long term, like it's okay now, but what happens later? And also commitment of resources. And the fact that there are not more firefighters coming into the business. They're leaving the business because it's causing them PTSD. They're away from their families. The seasons are long. They don't get paid enough. That, you know, you name it, the list goes on. There's not more people fighting fire anymore. They're less. So we can't ask more of those people until we get more workforce. And that's why I say if we can double down and get the same number of people out there prescribed burning as we have fighting fire, then, you know, maybe we'll actually start moving the needle.
Can you speak to the ecological effects of burning outside of normal fire windows, both prescribed fire and wildfire?
Yeah. Well, there's plant phenology to consider, and there's also just issues with wildlife at different times of year, reproductive cycles of animals. So it's kind of a broad question, but I would say most specifically, if you're burning for ecological purposes for managing certain plants, then you may want to burn when they're live if you want to have an effect on killing them. But if you want to rejuvenate them, you're generally needing to wait till they're senesced or dead to just remove the material and allow them to regenerate. I think in wildfire scenarios are a little more complicated because when you're burning, you're trying to make something burn. So there's an art to applying the fire and propagating fire and getting it to burn. Wildfires are typically a point source ignition and then it's moving. And there's some additional ignitions with management burning around them and such. But generally speaking, that's kind of more on its own, and so you're not manipulating the application as much. But I would say that in general, the seasonality of burning just has a really strong impact on the plant response. And so you can time the application of fire to generate those responses. I don't know if I'm going to go, I want to go too much. I could just feel like I could go down the rabbit trail on different species and what they do, but I'm not gonna.
I very much appreciate the point that you raised that climate change is now allowing you more preferred windows. in parts of California, there's now reached the stage where there are no burn windows. And in about 20 years, the last projections I saw, we couldn't grow Gary oak, which is a white oak, in this valley anymore, because it would be adapted to either chaparral or to evergreen live oak. So we've got about 20 years between the stage where the present densities were about 1% of the trees die per year naturally,
Yeah,
before about 50% of the trees are going to die within a decade and be replaced slowly by completely different species, if the projections are even close to right.
yeah,
But most of the time we underestimate the rate of climate change, not overestimate. And that means that half the biomass, different species, all these things are facing us no matter what we do. Even if we stop CO2 to zero right now, or 360 parts per million when I was born.
yeah.
So it's a challenge. I don't know the answer to it.
I know. Well, I'll tell you the one thing I know is that there's lots of biomass being produced by these changes, and something needs to be done with that material. I mean, it's either going to burn during wildfires, or we're going to remove it, or we're going to burn it. But the amount of Doug fir die-off and just the volume of fuels that is being created by that is pretty substantial. And as far as what species we're managing for in the future, that's a really tough one. I mean, there is some really good modeling showing a pretty substantial expansion of oak habitat for suitable oak habitat, because a lot of places that don't support oaks now will with that warming climate. So I think what we'll see is oak will move more so than just go away altogether.
There's a maximum of 10 kilometers a decade now.
Yeah.
No helpful words. But the rate of fire is making it up to 100 kilometers a decade. So it's got a problem.
We do. Yep.
Sorry.
No,
I don't
it's,
have a solution to that.
I know, I don't either, but, but I really appreciate your comments. We have to keep these things in mind.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
So we have an online question that sort of is piggybacking, or sort of piggybacks on the idea of burn windows anyway. This person is on the coast and notifying ODF to choose a good burn day in proximity, and being in proximity to towns and highways. On the coast, there's a lot of years where you can't do a burn due to burn windows. What can landowners and managers do to move forward with doing more prescribed burns when the burn windows there aren't as many opportunities for burn windows?
Yeah, so one of the things I've been working with is manipulating fuels to make them more available. Because one of the issues is that availability of fuels, it really depends on whether you're talking about live or dead vegetation, or a combination of both. And so if you're just trying to burn standing blackberry, your window is probably really narrow. If you cut all that blackberry and you create a dead fuel bed, you just opened your window up substantially. So when we say our burn windows are limited, that's true, but it actually depends on what we're burning. And so if we change the condition of what we're burning to something that's available during a wider set of windows and wider range of time, then we expand our burn window. And that's actually what we did at Cascade Head. One of the objectives was to reduce coyote brush. And we knew that the likelihood that we could do that with fire alone, with the condition that it was in, it wasn't very good. So we basically created slash all over with cut trees and cut brush to carry fire. It wouldn't have carried fire as well if we hadn't done that, because the coast has fog drip and so much moisture going on that it's the windows are limited. There was just a wonderful burn though, not even a few weeks ago, I think it was last week, for snowy plover habitat in Reefport because of the freezing temperatures, and then some offshore flow. So east winds, offshore flow, high pressure, putting smoke out into the ocean. The fuels were cured because it had been freezing. So, that's an example of a window that you can capitalize on, but you kind of have to be watching for all those conditions coming together. And obviously with private landowners, you have to work with ODF, but it's possible to, potentially get your fuels into condition that will burn better under a wider range of conditions. Otherwise it's really just that we're working with these smoke sensitive receptor areas where we're trying to protect public health and keep people safe. And so that's got to be the priority, unfortunately, when it comes to smoke. If that's what they're talking about with regards to the burn window. The environmental conditions, however, are a little different. That's where you can manipulate fuel to create more of that dead component. And you can mix it in with the live fuel to help propagate fire spread. We also did that to burn juniper in Central Oregon at Juniper Hills Preserve with TNC. And it was to reduce the wind threshold because you actually have to have quite a bit of wind to induce crown fire in juniper. And that was risky from a prescribed fire standpoint. So we cut huge buffers around the juniper and stuffed it all into the stand, then lit it so that it would propagate crown fire. It was really fun. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here in the room and online today. We appreciate you being part of the conversation, and please help me thank Amanda once again.